I'd love to get together with you sometime, Chris.
Yeah, likewise.
We'll work it out.
I'm a big fan, John.
Now, Emily, my partner, and she's in the next room, but you see her, for me, she's in the upper left-hand corner. She's waving there. And
Right.
Emily's father, Pete Harris, is in Minnesota.
Evening all.
Huh?
Good evening all.
Yeah. So I think that maybe Bobby will join up again. But at the same time, friends, we're also live on Facebook. And the Facebook people will just have to be patient with me because I was hoping I could interact with them with texts, but I can't read the text, so we'll just have to forge on. I'm very happy that whoever's on Facebook can participate, in this experience, in this environment. Yeah. Okay, so there are 6 of us live on Zoom tonight, and it's now 8:06. I'm using my iPhone to source the Facebook Live interactivity. Last week during the Facebook session, we had about 150 people who were watching and making comments, and then afterwards, probably another 100 people or so, maybe more, looked at the tape, the recording. So that's really a good thing to feel that there's this community here that's present. And as I've been saying in my emails, which sometimes might tend to seem a little bit cute or, predictable, but I've been saying that community equals immunity. And what I mean by that, without being sort of clever about it, it's just that there's a sort of, maybe it's an ephemeral, kind of tactile, ephemeral feeling when we're participating in something together. And in this case, we're working with a pretty strong force. We're living in this realm of maybe a pandemonium. Conveniently sounds like pandemic. Unfortunately, they seem to travel together. And at this time, I don't know, I've never lived through a world war, but this is pretty awesome in its scope. So if we're okay, just if we're fine by ourselves, in other words, let's say we can handle the normal stresses of this experience independently and individually through our own practices, or perhaps we're taking some herbal medicine, something that will help us stabilize ourselves in a certain calm sort of relationship to all this. Even if we're in that mode, which is a pretty convenient experience to be having, for some of us trained in meditation or trained in concentration or familiar with the creative process and the activity of being slightly introverted on demand to accomplish a certain performed creative process. And meditation is a creative process. So those of us who have that experience and training, to whatever degree, we may be okay in this situation, in this circumstance, but I'm sure Chris knows, the thousand monkey syndrome. The thousand monkey syndrome is quite fascinating, and it has something to do also with domino effect and when the moth, moves its wings, it changes the world in some way. But the thousand monkeys syndrome is quite specific when monkeys in different parts of the world, obviously without apparent contact with each other, when they all started breaking coconuts on rocks on one island, suddenly it started happening on other islands. So there's this theory that there's this possibility of critical mass. The idea of critical mass is when a certain portion or a percentage of population do something similar at the same time, that it has a wave effect on the rest of society, or a global kind of impact. There have been experiments made where people in Cincinnati, for example, and I'm just picking that as a random place, we could say Detroit or Chicago or Boston, but there are specific studies of, thousands of people meditating together at the same time for, let's say, a 2-week period. And the crime rate in that town went down, like remarkably down. So what I'm trying to get at is, even if we're in our most calm states, we still feel, whether we're cognizant of it or not, we may still feel this anxiety, for example, of the pandemonium that's here around us, And if we're very sensitive and perhaps maybe even a little bit unstable in our calmness, that can intervene in our calmness. Similarly, if we can develop a kind of maybe a kind of dialogue with that anxiety, a kind of conscious, tactile awareness of it, maybe we can, with our own calmness, radiate this calmness into that pandemonium, into that space of disruption. In other words, we can disrupt the disruption. And in that context, then, conceptually we can say, well, we're not part of the problem, we're part of the solution. So that's a cliche phrase, but if you see it sort of in the context that I'm proposing it, this is kind of at the core of the experience of empathy and altruism, and sort of, I don't mean altruism and compassion in a conceptual way, but the actual act of empathy, the actual act of altruism. That's a palpable, tangible, non-conceptual experience. This is an actual experience that we can, perhaps through love, through feeling of interconnectivity, become a bridge for wellness, well-being, a bridge for creativity. We know that in song, vibrations touch all of us, but the songs, the singers, the musicians, they're emanating those sensations. And we are feeling those sensations. We're having sensitized responses to those sensations. Similarly, with meditation, we can intentionally, volitionally, deliberately create patterns, create sensations with intention that intervene with our own anxieties, our own patterns. We have the opportunity to create totally new patterns that, in a sense, I almost want to use the word defy, but we're not rejecting our old patterns. We're deciding, in a sense, by training ourselves not to respond in the manner of our old patterns. So we're creating new patterns. We come to life as adults, perhaps, when we have some degree of responsibility for our own minds and our own circumstances, and responsibility for our own well-being. We come at times to the conclusion that we have been subject to the conditioning of our backgrounds, our cultural environments where we're born, that we're born into, the training we receive from our elders, from those who nurture us. We develop a concept of an I as separate from our mothers or parents. As time goes by, we cultivate our behavior sort of around the nucleus of the programming that we received, which makes a lot of sense. We keep building up, sort of layers of reification or reinforcement of those essential conditioning and patterns. And when we recognize that, some part of our mind is not that, because we can see that, we can recognize that, we can observe, oh, I'm in a bad mood. For example, that's a very simple, mundane example, but if I'm in a bad mood, who is it that knows that I'm in a bad mood? Is that some other me? Some other aspect of my mind that's sort of always there, watching? We don't necessarily need someone to say, hey, I think you're in a bad mood. But if we're so absorbed in ourselves having a bad mood, we may need someone to say, hey, I think you're in a bad mood. In our bad mood, we may be destructive and break something, and then it's like a mirror. Oh, I'm in a bad mood. But for most people, many people, it's possible to have this gift of self-observation. When we embark on meditation, a meditation experience or a contemplative experience, we're kind of playing in that space of the observer and the observed in a state of meditative absorption. When we meditate on an object, like the object of breath, or an external object like a detail of a flower, like a little detail of a flower, we can focus on that as a kind of tuning fork to stabilize the body. The body is not a conceptual problem. The body is a physical environment, a physical reality that we can work with as raw material. So when we begin to focus on one little detail, like that, and I just sit here and look at this, this thing stabilizes my body in a kind of, calm state, like a tuning fork. If I strike the tuning fork, I can tune my instrument to that tuning fork. So similarly, we use an external object to, again, like a bell, right? Right? We could also use, what do I have? Where is it? fell down. We could also use a little bit of lavender oil externally as a tuning fork. You understand? In the meditative experience of absorption, when I can focus on this object and stabilize my body, okay, all I'm doing is telling my mind is sort of programming my body to do this. But when my body does it, then my body is training my brain. And I'm creating a kind of circuit board in my brain. Literally, a physical circuit board is sort of created in the brain when we start to meditate. It's an observable, tangible fact that after 2 weeks of meditating 10 minutes a day, the prefrontal cortex grows more neuroplasticity, more brain matter is created in the prefrontal cortex. This is the last part of the human brain that was developed in evolution. And it's still developing. We can work with this material. Again, it's like raw material. During those 2 weeks, while we're meditating every day like that for 10 minutes, there's a little piece of the brain that's kind of like a walnut shape. Forgive me for not having a walnut handy, but it's about the size of a walnut. This little aspect of the brain that controls fight or flight. So when there's fear, anger, anxiety, that reptilian, that's the oldest part of the brain, this reptilian part of the brain called the amygdala, becomes less dense, less solid. It becomes more porous, and eventually it shrinks. This is measurable after 2 weeks of meditation practice. So, coming back to the state of meditative absorption, when we succeed without making this a kind of performance anxiety, but when we can train ourselves to concentrate on this little detail, the body becomes calm. When the body's calm, what's going to happen? The body is going to naturally de-stress itself. It wants to unwind. The body always wants to unwind. It doesn't really want to be compressed and tight and tied up and tense. The body doesn't want that. The brain doesn't want that. The unconscious really doesn't like that. So our natures, all human beings, all living creatures, even maybe a plant, the force, the surge of life does not want to be restricted or contained. So when we relax, all that stress, all that tension, all those toxins, all that compression is going to express itself. It's going to expand. It's going to relax. And as the body is relaxing, we have an abundant resource of energy to bring to concentration, to bring to meditation, to bring to creative activity, to bring to making love, to bring to cooking. As we relax, all of that, starts to flow. That energy that's been compressed and bound up, and what we call in the so-called Buddhist nomenclature attachment. When we become a little bit looser with our body and mind, this energy abundantly sort of occurs. It's kind of like, so you got to be prepared, well fed, what do we call this again?
Hydration.
Hydrated, right? Under the normal circumstances of contemplative practice, we want to bring a healthy body state to it, particularly when we're training, when we're learning. That's important. But again, coming back to this meditative absorption, when I'm looking at this object, and please, it could be any kind of neutral detail, not something that's going to sort of give me a narrative content, something neutral, like a flower or a leaf or a dot on the wall or, a piece of a detail. We're disciplined enough to have the capacity to make that decision, what is neutral, what is not. But the point is that when we're able to concentrate and, in a sense, we almost merge with this thing because we're tuning into this thing, we're resonating with that thing. There's a kind of feedback, a tactile feedback. When we're looking at that thing, bear in mind, keeping focus on that very fine detail. Everything around it could be changing shape, could be changing color. It might feel like an LSD flashback, whatever. We might feel like we're hallucinating. We might feel that that dot is going like 2 feet away and coming back. Okay, these are all very subtle indications that we are concentrating. We shouldn't be disturbed by those phenomena as long as we anchor our attention on that fine point. And what the Dalai Lama told me very specifically when we talked about this is that the mind has to be aware, alert, awake, fresh. We don't get into kind of a dull, perception of this thing where we're just kind of like, blah. The mind wants to be crisp and fresh. Awareness wants to be available, continually, spontaneously refreshed through the breath, through the posture. Okay, when we're training ourselves, this is sort of the recommended manner of doing that. When our minds, our unconscious, start to blossom and bloom, and the fragrance of our past, the anxiety about the future or the desires for the future, all this kind of stuff begins to emerge from the mind. Great stuff, old stuff, fantasies, desires, sensations, all these sorts of clouds of, billowing clouds of emotional stuff, conceptual stuff, all those sorts of conceptual structures, and even perhaps the core of how those structures became thoughts, how they became sensations, emotions. In this state of blossoming awareness and the, let's say, potentially disruptive content that comes into our mind, if we're able to remain in concentration on that spot, we're not going to be blown away by that spot, and we're not going to be blown away by the corona pandemonium. We remain in this stable state of open channel awareness and a kind of what the Buddhist vocabulary would call equanimity. There's no bad, there's no good. There's just, everything is sort of in this more inclusive context. We're not rejecting our thoughts. We're not self-criticizing. We're not criticizing others. We may see our tendency to self-criticize, but we don't get into it. It's like you're going through channels on TV. You see that channel of self-criticism, you see that channel of, self-righteous criticism, you see our entitlement, training, our sense of self-absorption, egocentricity. We see that. We see the tendencies for that. Just in relationship to our own feedback, what's coming out of our unconscious. So the fun part about this experience is that we have extraordinary mobility in that state. And there are many ways to sort of train ourselves to access that state. But if we want to go from one mode, our old patterns, right, Kayla, does this sound familiar? If we want to go from our old patterns into this more new sort of highly creative potential pattern, where self-judgment and criticism and judgment, sort of are just like vapors in the space. We don't get too involved with it. We have to have some confidence that there's a method of doing that. So in the Sanskrit and in the old tantric, language of Tibetan Buddhism, they call those things vehicles. Like you got to build a boat to go from one island to the other island, or maybe to the other bigger continent where there are more possibilities. They came, my relatives, my family, they came from Italy on a boat to a big country, America, right? Well, it's not so different than that. We're building this boat through our discipline of meditative contemplative training. Now, you can go to a guru and let your guru be your tuning fork. Let the incense, be, sort of the more tangible tuning fork. You can go to a psychiatrist and take medication, and the medication will stabilize us, within a certain context and sensation. But we have to bring our own confidence to those circumstances, believing that that boat, that teacher, that structure is stronger than our old conditioning. Otherwise, if we bring our old conditioning to the new mode, we're going to pervert the experience of the new conditioning, the new programming, the new patterns. So, when a very extreme Catholic person, for example, comes to meditation, we may bring, myself included, we may bring all the sort of trappings and belief systems and iconic archetypal structures from that belief system to this new system. Inevitably we do. But, for example, in the Tibetan context that I've been trained in and kind of familiar with, you can, put water on your altar, 7 bowls of water on your altar. You can light a candle. You can, light the incense, right? It's the whole ritual, light your incense. Okay? Right? You go through that. And this is all wonderful stuff. It's all good. You can ring the bell. Right? You can do your 3 prostrations on the floor. Then you might do a little bit of breathing training. What's this all about? What's it all about if it's not intervening with the old conditioning? If it's not breaking down the structure of our patterns, physical and mental patterns? We are sort of absorbing ourselves, immersing ourselves, and inhabiting this other culture. I don't mean religious culture, a new culture of the body-mind training. So I've been calling this naked mind. So if we come back to that meditative absorption that I mentioned before, I mentioned about 7 times. In the meditative state, there is no meditator. There is no object of meditation. There is no meditating. It's called no subject, object, or action. The three words that these are three aspects. These three aspects of subject, object, action merge. They dissolve. The thresholds between these things no longer exist. And that's when we may be experiencing what we can call a non-dual experience. Non-dual, non-conceptual experience. And in that non-dual, non-conceptual state, we're in the here and now. We're in the present. So if we can sustain ourselves in the present, then the context of our mind going into the past or the future is suddenly embraced in a sense, or infused with the experience of being in the here and now. So they lose their potency. They lose their potency to control our behavior. We become less the subject of our emotions, thoughts, and reactions. We become less subjected to our old patterns of behavior. And so that's why it's called liberation. It's called liberation. So in a sense, when problems like traumas, conflicts, obstacles occur in our lives, from a yogic perspective, that's like just more wood for the fire. That's more fuel, that's more material to process in this non-conceptual state. And that's where we come into the potential to transform what we might experience as negative energy or negativity. In that state, we're sort of free from our old reactions. And we have the power to respond. So metaphorically, if I've had a trauma and I process that trauma in that space, even if I process it in psychotherapy, I'm still processing it. Once that trauma, once I don't reject the trauma, once I'm not pushing that trauma back, once I allow myself to feel the full power, even if it's very emotional and sad, once I enable myself to feel that and go through that process of emotion, including all the self-judgment and self-recrimination and self-loathing and all of those programs that came from who knows who or where, but that I took with me on my boat. All that stuff, when I drop it, I see that trauma in all its component parts. And it becomes a treasure of experience. So now that we're sort of homebound, most of us, we have an opportunity to engage, with our stuff. And our stuff is experience. We have experiences, very rich experiences, without qualifying ourselves, without identifying with the experiences. They're just experiences. If I look at, if I look at a postcard, and this postcard gives me all kinds of sensations, associations, intellectual ideas, if it triggers certain knowledge I have about the culture and such about this thing. But if I look at it long enough, this damn thing is just some ink on a cardboard piece of paper. And I'm responding to this thing as though it's something alive. But I'm doing that. I'm projecting myself into this postcard. That's a very interesting thing. I find it interesting. So the traditional title of this kind of meditation that I'm talking about, in English it's called calm abiding. Calm abiding. And well, the body is calm and the mind is abiding. You know, awareness is abiding with all of the phenomena that appear from the unconscious, all of the toxins that are being released from the body, all the stress that's being let go. We're calmly abiding with that. In fact, more wood for the fire. Bring it on. Bring on the issues. Bring on the conflicts. Bring on the arguments. Bring on the unresolved, relationships. Bring them on. Because if we can resolve them within our own minds, within our own space, we defuse the power of our conditioning and we liberate ourselves to act with creativity, with volition, with a certain kind of authority in the here and now, free of judgment and, sort of discursiveness, free of rationalizing our behavior, because we don't need to rationalize behavior if behavior is sensitized to the interconnectivity that we all have with each other and with everything. I don't want to hurt Emily, because that's hurting a sort of bigger space of me. Of course, I love her. I don't want her to feel in some way pain. In fact, if I can create circumstances where she wouldn't experience pain, I would do that. But how can we, if you talk about recycling your compost, well, what are you doing with people in your lives? What are we doing? Are we treating them with respect, Because it's the same deal. Our inner ecology, how we feel about ourselves, spills out into how we relate to other people. And if I respect myself or my body, I'm certainly going to respect the physical environment. We're interconnected. We know that the consequences of our actions, even of our thoughts, produce a pattern, produce behavior, produce phenomena. So if we can resolve or begin to feel some flexibility in our unconscious, we're going to reduce the suffering that we would not have reduced otherwise. And that's a fantastic gift for ourselves and for our community, our family, and the future for the world. That's it. So it really comes down to recognizing three things, maybe three things. We're conditioned, we have patterns, we can create new patterns to, in a sense, transform the old patterns into desired outcomes. Yeah. And if we want to have desired outcomes, projects, relationships, a better world, we could start to generate the sensations of those desired outcomes right now in our body as visualizations, as imagination that has impregnated good intention, altruism, well-being. When those things get, imbued into the circuitry of our neuroplasticity in our brain, we're creating a new brain. We're creating a new operating system, a new default system. It's not that the old system vanishes, but the old system becomes new content for the new system to work with. The ego is no longer driving us around. We're no longer the tool of our ego. We're driving the ego around. Ego's in the back seat. We're using ego to create well-being, positive outcomes. And if we do this together in the context of a community, we have the support, the resonance of this community going into that. So that's why the sort of culture of the ashram, the sangha, the community, the commune, the band, the musical band, the tribes, the family, the clan. This has power. Well, how are we going to use our power? Mantra, right? You use your prayer beat and do mantra. Again, we're generating sensations that liberate us from old patterns. Why make it so complicated? Okay, belief systems. What's the function of a belief system if not to be dominated by the belief system? Then the function of a belief system is a placeholder to enter into this other space. It's a threshold. A belief system is like a placeholder, a threshold to this bigger, more sort of universal culture. It doesn't matter if you're a shaman in the forest in Brazil, or in Peru, or a medicine woman in Turkestan, or a healer. It doesn't matter if you're a Catholic or a Buddhist, or tonight is Seder. The Jews are celebrating Seder tonight. Once we sort of arrive at this space of interconnectivity awareness and the cognizance of our impact in the world and our impact on our own minds and bodies, once we arrive at that sort of state, liberated from old conditioning and behavior, we're home. We're home free. It's like all roads lead to Rome, But when you're in Rome, every road leads outside Rome. So when you're in that state of open channel appreciation, open channel gratitude and generosity, when you're in that state of inclusiveness and a sort of awareness of our potential and impact in the world, when you're there, whatever you do leads out of Rome. Whatever you do radiates, because you become the tuning fork for the way you want things to be. Okay, not selfishly, all right, but perhaps in an altruistically selfish way. Yes, we're going to create a better world for ourselves and for others, okay? So, at the beginning of a practice, usually we invoke what was called motivation. Motivation to liberate ourselves from these conditioned patterns, and investing the practice that we're going to have, whatever that practice is. Could be naked mind practice, could be Tibetan Buddhism, Sufism, whatever it is, Native American tradition. But once we enable the process of those practices, we're in motion. We created motivation. Now we're in motion. In that motion, we're going to go through a process of calming the body, concentrating, having this sort of inclusiveness, this state of inclusiveness in our body and our minds. Perhaps visualizing some desired outcome in the process of this practice. Experiencing maybe, if we're fortunate, some relative state of liberation or non-conceptual experience. And at the end, after this sort of series of activities, motivation, right, the action of the practice, and then at the end, something that we sort of say, well, whatever benefit I had, whatever benefit I experienced from this practice, may that have an impact, a positive impact in the world. I can sit here and intentionally, through my non-conceptual, sensitized state of radiant concern and engaged compassion, I can actually send healing energy to somebody I know isn't well. I can radiate that by focusing on Pete in Minnesota, or Kayla, or Chris, or Emily, or Samantha. We can all do that together. So at the end of the practice, you kind of take this bigger heart, bigger space, and say, okay, so now not only am I going to be existing in this world in this state, hopefully in a post-meditative sort of potential state, but I'm going to generate well-being, good intention from my mind, from my heart. And then maybe I sit there for a while after my practice, take a few breaths, really engage in the here and now after meditation exercise. And by the way, imbued in motivation at the very beginning is already the outcome, because there's no separation really. It's just a physical, mental sort of experience or process. So, they say God is everywhere. Well, then God is here. Inseparable from God out there. Everybody's a Buddha. Yeah? I knew an artist who said everybody's an artist. Well, take it seriously. And it has consequences, so what kind of consequences do we want? Do we really need a pandemic to sort of guide us into this kind of self-reflection? Maybe not, but we're here. Here we are. I have no idea what time it is, but well, I've been going at it for about 50 minutes. So that, those practices, that particular practice of Shinei, tranquil abiding, what do you call it? Calm abiding? It's called Shinei in Tibetan language. S-H-I-N-A-Y, Shinei. I have all these books, okay? Here's a great look. Let me just read a quote from this book. Check this out. Please grant the blessings to accomplish great progress in action. This is a little bit elegant language. The primordial ground of one's own awareness is unchanging and unmoving. Whatever arises as the expression of wisdom is neither good nor bad. Since awareness of nowness is actually the Buddha, the completely and free, serene Lama is revealed in one's innermost heart. When this original mind is realized as the very nature of the Lama, there's no need for whining or contrived prayers made with grasping and attachment. By letting go in the free natural flow of uncontrived awareness, not holding whatever arises, the blessings of self-liberation are obtained. Through fabricated practice, there's no time to achieve enlightenment. That meditation, produced through mental analysis and intellect, is a deceiving enemy. Now, conceptualization falls apart with the abandon of a mad person. Let this life be spent in a state of uninhibited, naked ease. that's a kind of text from what is called the Great Perfection. It's called Great Perfection. And the Shin practice is derived from that tradition. Shin. Quickly, I'll go into the sky eating practice. Because the Shin practice is very sort of confined. It's a very confined thing. It's like you're looking through a microscope, which becomes a telescope eventually. You're looking at that one point, but contradictorily, that dualistic experience of this and me, or me and that, or this and that, by focusing that, it's like putting a wild snake into a pipe. Once you focus your body into that one spot, it's possible to arrive at this state of interconnectivity. If I merge myself with this thing through this intentional focus, and it should be like a kind of laser-like focus, the quality of that focus, we can adjust it eventually so it's just enough to concentrate. Yeah, it's not like you have to like strain and go crazy obsessively looking at that spot, but in the beginning you really want to calmly but intently focus. So in a sort of bizarre way, by looking at that spot, we enter into this extremely expansive state. But bear in mind that we're training ourselves here in this exercise. It's a training. Now, similarly, we can go out into the open sky, and look up at the sky. Excuse me. And having had a little bit of experience in this confined environment, now we're in this big open space of the sky, and we can sort of relate to that expansiveness, that sort of interconnective space that the sky kind of evokes when we look at the sky. And so the experience of clouds passing in front of, between us and that expansiveness, well, it's kind of seen like thoughts. Thoughts are like those clouds in the vastness of our aware mind. So it's also very sensually and tangibly nurturing to look up at the sky and do sky eating practice, which is called a formless practice, a practice that doesn't have form. In a sense, the recognition of spaciousness in our body and mind, you could say, is the form. In emptiness there's form, and in form there's emptiness. So in the emptiness of the sky and the spaciousness of our body, we find the practice, the form, which is anyway non-attached. We're not having an ego experience with our bodies at that time. We might say, oh wow, I'm really a great meditator, but okay, that's just my programming. That's just my programming that does that. I can say, oh God, I have this programming, yeah. Let me get back to the sky. So at any point in the practice of Shin, looking at this thing, at any point we can stop and begin again. And that's aerobic exercise for the brain, stopping and starting. That's good stuff. If we get distracted, we have to go to the bathroom, we may find ourselves going down a rabbit hole, of narrative thoughts, looking at this thing. That's normal. Absolutely normal. But the fact that it's happening is a good sign. It's a good sign. When we can't check or relating to that in an objective way, once we become subject of our thinking pattern, our old pattern, then it's good to bring the awareness back to the point, back to the detail, bring the awareness back there. And if that pattern persists, if it's kind of like, I can't really do this, better take a break. Take a break. So it's advised in the beginning of this particular practice that we keep the sessions short. Meaning, I begin with motivation, and let me just go through this. Begin with motivation. Okay, maybe that's a minute of motivation, or even 30 seconds. But I'm starting to gear my body down. Maybe I do yoga first, or exercise, or take a run, or ride a bike, whatever, breathing, to prepare for meditation. Because I know my body should be relaxed. So I want to take care of that criteria. And then I begin to do a practice, maybe it's actually a breathing practice that's contemplative. Because, Chris, for example, you might make a note of that. If you don't know, Kayla, you probably heard it. You guys, I know you all, other people have heard it, that when we breathe less than 5 times a minute, we produce a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is like the feel-good chemical in the body. So serotonin, by its own nature, produces a meditative state. So if we recognize that the serotonin is starting to flow after we breathe intentionally for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, then maybe it's a good time to begin the meditation. So how do we breathe? Essentially, we want to evacuate the lungs completely. We want to compress the upper chest, the middle rib cage, and the abdomen. Compress it against our skeleton, so that we're really, really eliminating the air from the mouth. And ideally, if we can, inhale very sweetly through the nostrils into the lowest part of our torso as possible. And building on that sort of egg, or that sort of nucleus of air, we're building, the belly is expanding. It's permitting the lung to absorb more volume. We're expanding the middle of the rib cage, not in just a lateral way, but in an orbital way. The rib cage, imagine like an orb, is expanding. And then we're, expanding the upper chest, inhaling. Huh? So that even the skin, the pores of our skin are sort of breathing, because they are breathing. But those pores are even opening, we can sense it. So that enables us to breathe maybe less than 5 times a minute. We breathe 22,000 times a day. If you breathe 4 or 5 times a minute, it cuts it in half, basically. We normally breathe about 15 times a minute, and usually it's in the upper chest alone. So we're already reversing an extraordinary pattern, a respiration pattern. We're already right there intervening with a pattern. So the practice begins like that. We're kind of like building up a fire and creating the energy, and the serotonin, a great internal climate physically that we can cognizantly observe. And those observations are kind of like signposts for when we practice, in the future. We're developing a vocabulary through physical intelligence, physical awareness, physical intelligence. Body is very intelligent. It's generating infinite signals to us all the time, to our awareness. So we become more sensitized to that. So that might take, 5 minutes, and we're into a proper sort of climate for meditation practice. It's kind of wacky to just sit down and say, I'm going to start to meditate. It's kind of rude, It's like not good etiquette with the body. So it's pretty nice to sort of set up the situation, so that's the whole deal, the ritual. You put the water on the thing and the candle, and you slow down and you prostrate and all that stuff. All of that stuff is imbued or involved, included, integrated with the simple gestures of motivation, breathing, and good intention, you know. But of course, if I'm whacked out, and believe me, I'm no stranger to that. If I've been hit, you know, if I've been hit in the head with some, or you know, got a big body bruise in life, I'm going to go back to my old practices. I'm going back. I'm going back to the shrine. I'm going back. I'm going to prostrate, all that stuff. But let me just contextualize this. I made a t-shirt that says, no-ism, right? So Buddhism eventually is no-ism. It's a system that liberates you from the old system and it liberates you from itself. Ultimately, we don't need these sort of impositions. But because we're distorted and out of balance, because we're, you know, confused, we kind of have to comb our bodies and our brains in a very compassionate, loving way. So at 5 minutes in, we can begin to do this practice, you know, of looking at a thing. Now, you know, I think I've tried to give you some input about the structure of the practice, looking at this thing. It's helpful to continually be present with the breath. You know, be present in the body, because it's not a brain experience. It's a body experience that has a brain in it. Meditation is not an intellectual problem. You know, it can't be sort of, you can't kind of screw ourselves into it intellectually. It's an experience. Here's a great book called Fearless Simplicity. I don't know if you can read the title. Fearless Simplicity. And the title speaks, you know, volumes about the sort of nature of the activity, or the context, the philosophy of it, perhaps. So the meditative session of looking at the flower, try to keep it to 3 minutes. 3 minutes in the beginning, that's a lot of concentration. We may feel after a minute and a half or 2 minutes that we're kind of arriving at a state of concentration. The physical feedback may be seeing light flashing, colors inverting, you know, green goes to red, etc. But we're still concentrating on that one spot. The space relationship to it may change because our bodies are becoming more sensitized, and these are physical feedback signals coming from the body that we are actually meditating. We're entering the space of concentration. And, you know, we may be interrupted by thoughts. Oh, I'm a bad meditator. I can't do this. What a drag. I failed once again. Congratulations. That is the unconscious mind unburdening itself. Like, you know, like a knot, right? The unconscious mind does not really enjoy being knotted. It wants the sort of force of the knot itself will unknot itself. Don't interfere with the unknotting of the unconscious mind. Let it flow. Let thoughts appear. Thoughts, when they appear, have identifiably 4 characteristics. A thought may come one at a time. Similar thoughts coming one at a time. Another aspect, there are identifiably 4. Maybe there are more, but at least 4. Another one is thoughts may just come randomly, not observably associated with each other. Another aspect of thoughts are that they come in bundles, like a whole bunch of, like a file folder just popping open and all these thoughts are coming out. And another thought which is most deceiving, another pattern is most deceiving, is the illusion that we're not thinking. But the experience of not thinking is kind of like being on a drug. It's kind of like being depressed. It's kind of like, yeah, what,
Oh, I just had when you were explaining thoughts, I had when you were talking about creating narratives when you're trying to concentrate, you said it in this way where it made me think about how creating a narrative affirms like a dualistic way of thinking or looking, and that when we're concentrating, we're actually going into a non-dual state. So I hadn't really thought about that before, that the thoughts are kind of reiterating a dualistic way when you're doing it, creating a narrative about...
Now, listen, Emily. I want to ask you a very personal question, an intimate question, because meditation couldn't be more intimate experience. But when you say what do you call it? Reaffirming. What does that experience feel like? What is that experience doing? What is that experience? Can you tell?
Well, I think it's when you showed your example of the knot. It's like pulling that knot and making it tighter.
How would you imagine, or how do you remember experiencing that yourself? From a sort of tangible, tactile, experiential way.
Well, it's like a frustration or a tightness in the body.
So it's like an immediate feedback.
I think so.
So if you feel that tightness in your body, you may recognize that you're what you call reaffirming that pattern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. 10 years ago, when I started teaching meditation reluctantly with my friend Ken Frey, we were very concerned about that, Emily. We wanted to know, are people tightening the knot, strengthening the muscles of past conditioning, right? Or are we loosening up? Are we liberating? Are we freeing up that compression, those attachments, right? And so we thought the best way to explore and the best way to be responsible and conscientious about teaching meditation was to ask people for their feedback. What's going on in the meditative session? What's happening to you? How did you relate to that thought? How did you relate to relating to that thought? See? So your question, based on your own experience and your own nature of, like everyone wants to be free. I don't mean free like, I'm free, man, but like internally free. Spiritually, I'm sorry I used the word spiritual, but there you go. What we call spiritual, maybe it's a whole new criteria once we have these experiences. Mystical, what does mystical mean? Well, once you've had an experience of non-conceptuality, that can be totally mind-blowing. You might see the colors of the flowers in a totally irradiant, iridescent way that you've never seen before. Look at David Hockney's paintings that are coming out of this, pandemic. They're totally alive and bright and brilliant. So that can be a mystical experience if we haven't had that experience before. But in actuality, it's a very normal experience. It's a very natural experience. It's just that we weren't told that before. We didn't know that. Chris and I had a wonderful opportunity to work with an art instructor who was a kind of life coach in a certain remote way. And, you know, in some way I think we got a leg up on some of this stuff. I don't know, Chris, and maybe it's another, you know, discussion we could have, but, you know, no one really told us about this. So it seems mystical or spiritual. Mystical or spiritual. But that's the thing, Emily. You don't want to reinforce those old patterns, and we have to really mine the profit of the meditative experiences, to mine how it is that we trick ourselves. How it is that we deceive ourselves in the meditation experience, and even how is it that we deceive ourselves by not meditating? Oh, I don't need to meditate today. You know, I'll do it tomorrow, or maybe on the weekend. You know, Chris, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I love duality. I love the concept of non-dual. So when I invoke, and excuse me, just give me a minute here. I prefer, when I meditate, when I get real contemplative, when I do your flower pointillism and then the simultaneity with Focus throws, okay, particle, wave, location, momentum. Taking that a step further, I invoke a lot of Einstein mass energy equilibrium. And what I mean by that is it's a mutual exclusivity, so that each phase is non-dual, but the comprehension of the non-duality by necessity needs an ultimate duality.
Ultimate means what, Chris?
Well, gravity and light, your particle on the flower and sky, okay? The mindfulness of focusing on the particle on the flower for 3 minutes and then going outdoors and looking up at the heavens is incredible. But in each case, knowing that there's a flip side to the experience enhances that experience of the separate piece.
Okay.
Conceptually, space-time is when Einstein's relativity teaches us that space and time are inseparable. Yet when you go to the origin or center of gravity, wherever the heck that is, time stops. Conversely, when you're traveling at the speed of light, time stops. So somewhere between the perfect stasis of the now and the perfect dynamic of the speed of light, we exist. But the interesting thing is, and this is what I focus on, is the utter 180-degree difference between the satiety of gravity and the dynamic of light, or your particle on your flower and the heavens.
So there's this.
So that's a simultaneity of non-dual with duality, or better yet, a mutual exclusivity that can be of a reaffirmed dialogue and alignment. But I don't mean alignment like identical parts. I mean like a reciprocal alignment where there is a give and take, a pull and push.
Kind of like a black hole?
Well, black hole is something else. That's ultimately that's the answer to where seeing and observing or getting pictures now for the first time of black holes is telling us that there's a lot of dark matter out there that's invisible. Okay, and scientists call it WIMPs, a weak interactive massive particles. There's a lot of invisible matter and energy that has to happen that we can't see, that we don't know about. And people ask, well, how do we know that we don't know that? Well, the answer is black holes. The answer is we look at telescopes and we not only see the outer edges of the universe, but that they're expanding, and that they're not only expanding, but they're exponentially expanding. So I use that stuff when I'm simultaneously taking your example of looking at a particle on a flower.
So,
And it's unbelievable. And it's unbelievable. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I needed to do a long time ago.
I think it's really fun to begin to take seriously this idea of emptiness. The Buddhist idea of emptiness is not vacantness or voidness. It's expansiveness. It's space. Spaciousness is emptiness. So it's this quality of sort of like all the molecules in our body are vibrating in the space of emptiness too. Just like, you know, is happening out in the world around us. So thoughts, from a subjective point of view, thoughts are structures made of component parts. And if we gaze at the detail of the flower, for example, or you could also imagine there's an orb of light in the skull, even more sensual is to immerse our attention within the skull, a little pea-sized glowing orb of light. If we're in that state, if we can sustain that state, let's say that we're observing a thought that comes into the field of our awareness. Well, if we are like a field, an energy field, or a meadow field, and this object comes into the space of that field, like a thought, or a cloud, or an animal in a meadow, if we are resonating as that field, as the thisness or the nest of now, the nestness of now, the quality of now, if we're resonating in that quality of now, then when that object or thought or creature comes into the space of our awareness, if we allow it to just exist there without intervening in its status, that thing, for example, a thought, may deconstruct into its component parts. And then we recognize perhaps the meaning, significance, or value that object, that thought had in our subjective perception of it, our relative perception of it. And we have an absolute pure perception of it as being imbued with emptiness.
Yeah.
And so there you have the dance of duality and non-duality. So from a practice point of view of yogic discipline, there is in nirvana samsara. There is in liberation, there is duality. And in duality, there's also liberation. From an experiential point of view, our relationship with solid things could change. Our interconnection.
Temporal things too.
What's that?
Temporal.
Absolutely.
Space
Absolutely.
and time. you talk about empty space, you
Yeah.
have to add the concept of timelessness.
Yeah. So duality is a very convenient thing to relate with, but it's not as solid as it appears to be. It's just convenient, to relate to it in a solid way. But we don't need to make it more solid than it is. It's we know it's very interesting stuff. So I'm curious about your experience, Chris. If you experiment and do a little pioneering for a week or so with that technique, I'd be really grateful to hear about it. And I'm here, to interact with you, to talk about it during the time if you're interested in doing that. How about you, Samantha? How are you doing? You have to unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I'm just thinking a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure. I don't really have a question. I'm just sort of mulling all this over. But thinking about, and I'm not sure I followed 100% what you were talking about, Chris, but I was thinking about how we could think about space and time as two different things, but one cannot exist without the other, right? The duality is almost the essence of the existence. And then thinking about, I also get caught up in my own, when meditating, myself viewing the thoughts and not knowing when is myself viewing the thought or noticing the thought, when is that unknotting the knot and when is that reinforcing the old pattern. Like I can't differentiate which is which. And that gets a little confusing. And then sometimes I think, oh, relax, it's not that complicated.
Yeah, right. I don't think it's that complicated, but stay focused.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the theater. That's the theater where all this stuff is going to play out.
Mm-hmm.
No, just taking an hour and a half from our normal, routine and mundane existence to have this kind of encounter or experience, that is also an intervention. In our patterns. So, we may even be a little threatened by the potential of the kind of freedom that's implicit in what we're examining. Kayla, how are you doing?
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay. I am thinking a lot and reflecting kind of on everything that's being said, and for me it's been a few years since I had returned. Like, this is me coming back after like 3 years of being away from your teachings, John, and
you're just doing research. You're just doing research out in the field.
Yeah, exactly. Putting it to work. A lot of old habits got re-cemented, but I've been watching them and noticing them. But one thing I'm thinking about right now in talking about it's kind of my thoughts going off of the dualism idea, is the experiences that I did have in class when meditating, when I did feel the interconnectedness. It happened twice, and I remember both times palpably. And I'm thinking about how, with all the classes that I went to and all the time that I spent there, the power and the impact of the
retreat. And the retreat as
well, but there was one time in class where I felt that rose go into me, and I was out with the rose, and time did not exist, like nothing was there, like the flower was inside of me, and I felt it 100% like inside of my heart. And it was amazing. And I remember that feeling like so palpably. and it's with me, and the power of like the seconds that it lasted in time has taken over the memories of all of the classes. Like it's so the power of it being like it being something that takes almost as though it was a longer period of time for it to exist, but it was seconds when it actually happened, or less than that, maybe a second. What if I was so lucky?
I know. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm thinking about right now is like the impact. You spend all this time meditating and doing all this stuff, and the like second that it happens winds up being this like mind opening, transformational, exists without and within time and bounds, and things just don't exist. And I'd love to get back there. So
Okay, I want to find something for you guys because this is pretty amazing. You know what I'm looking for, Emily? Okay, can I read this to you guys?
Yes.
Probably take about 90 seconds. Imagine punching holes in a sheet of paper with a needle. In the same way, the needle of discriminating intelligence that reveals the state of egolessness is able to perforate the dualistic mind. The light of the ground that's always present as essence, nature, and capacity begins to shine through. There's a little ray of light. Then the strong habit of conceptualizing covers it up again. That's like tying the knot or tightening the knot. But then you punch another hole, and again there's some light. It's not the complete illumination from the ground, just a little ray of light coming through a little hole. You could say that a fragment or a portion or a little part of the ground meaning this non-conceptual awareness, shines through as a tiny ray of light. Training in mind essence is like punching one hole after another. Samsara's deluded perceptions get more and more perforated so that it's not so solid anymore. At a certain point, it just falls apart. So, Kayla, what you described is the kind of like a gap. And it could just be a nanosecond. That's what happened to me like 15 years ago or 12 years ago. I suddenly had this very fleeting moment of that non-conceptual expansive awareness, but it was a timeless experience that stained my mind. It stained my awareness, my consciousness, my physical being changed as a result of that. My relationship to material changed. So he says the gaps between thoughts reveal basic wakefulness. Our training is to allow more and more gaps. Allow the needle to puncture deluded perceptions again and again. In the beginning, these openings don't last that long. Only short moments, like pinpricks from the needle. We need to perforate the paper persistently, making more and more holes. That's fearless simplicity. Sounds a little scary because we're really abandoning our attachment to conditioned mind. But there's a big payoff. What's up? What does it say? Pete, happy birthday. We're really glad that you would gift us with your presence tonight on your birthday. And we all of us who know you and who are getting to know you want you to have, many more enjoyable birthdays coming up. And they will be coming up. I love you, Pete.
Many happy returns.
Sorry, my computer died. I don't know what happened.
PowerPoint.
My laptop. No, it wasn't that.
Oh, no. Okay. So anyway, we send you our encouragement, our confidence. You know, through experience, we develop confidence. And that confidence is like the boat, you know, that's able to, you know, like sail through the roughest currents and the biggest waves and, you know, the storms. So the frequency of practice, even in one session, if we practice like 3 minutes, 5 times, with taking little breaks in between, there you go, you have 20 minutes or 25 minutes of immersion. And, you know, the frequency is where it really matters in the brain matter, you know. So, you know, let's build the boat, and let's make a good fleet. There's a lot of work to do. Wish that we had more time to practice together, but if you would like, we can do that individually with Zoom, or we could, you know, make sure that next week we have a couple of real practice sessions. I've just tried to, you know, refresh and inform a little bit tonight.